At my father's lavish promotion party, my mother practically shoved me out of the way to introduce her golden child to his boss. She pointed a dismissive finger at me and told the CEO I was just a college dropout who never amounted to much. The powerful executive stared at me, all the color draining from his face. He turned to my mother and said that her daughter actually owns the holding company that just bought them out. He told her I sign his paycheck. The entire room went dead silent. My father slowly turned around, realizing he had been working for me for the last 5 years without having a single clue. I am Sienna, 34 years old, and tonight I brought my toxic family's house of cards crashing down. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to prove your worth to the people who should have loved you the most. Growing up in an affluent suburb of Chicago meant everything revolved around appearances. My parents built their entire identities on country club memberships, luxury cars, and the illusion of absolute perfection. Tonight was the ultimate display of their vanity. My father Thomas was celebrating his upcoming promotion to regional director at Vanguard Financial. He had rented out the grand ballroom of the Oak Brook Country Club, a place where crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over people who measured your worth by the brand of your shoes. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors, brushing snowflakes from my simple wool coat. I had barely stepped into the grand foyer when my mother Brenda marched up to me. There was no greeting, no smile, and certainly no hug. She snatched the coat right off my shoulders and shoved a heavy stack of dirty appetizer plates directly into my hands. "Put these in the back right now," she hissed, her manicured fingers gripping my arm tightly. "And do not mingle with the guests. Thomas has his boss arriving any minute, and we need this evening to be absolutely flawless." I looked at the grease smeared on the fine china, then looked up at her perfectly powdered face. I gently but firmly placed the stack of dirty plates onto a nearby floral pedestal. "I am a guest, Mom," I said calmly. "I am not the waitstaff." Brenda gasped, her eyes darting around to see if anyone had witnessed my quiet defiance. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in a familiar sneer. "You are still wearing that cheap dress 5 years ago when you threw away your law degree to play on computers in a basement. I told you that you would end up starving. Now look at you. You cannot even afford to dress properly for your own father's event. Look at your sister. She actually knows how to represent this family." Right on cue, my younger sister Sydney glided into the foyer. She was draped in a custom Vera Wang gown that easily cost $5,000, holding a glass of champagne and laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made. Sydney was the golden child, the one who never had to struggle for affection or financial support. "We gladly paid for Sydney's lifestyle brand because she actually has ambition," my mother continued, her voice rising to make sure the nearby guests could hear her bragging. "She is a real entrepreneur. You just vanished and threw your life away. Do not ruin your father's night with your bad attitude." The irony was almost suffocating. My mother praised Sydney for a lifestyle brand that produced nothing but debt while completely dismissing the 5 years of grueling work I had put into building my own life. I had not vanished. I had simply stopped begging for their approval. While they were busy funding Sydney's shopping sprees disguised as business expenses, I was coding algorithms and building a financial technology firm from the ground up. But I did not say any of that. I simply stood my ground, refusing to let her toxic words penetrate the armor I had spent years building. Before Brenda could hurl another insult, my father rushed into the foyer. He was sweating profusely, tugging nervously at his expensive silk tie. His eyes swept right past me, treating me as if I were just another piece of furniture. "Brenda," he gasped, his voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and sheer panic. "He is here. David Mitchell just pulled up to the valet. Get Sydney over here right now. We all need to be on our best behavior. This man holds my entire future in his hands." I froze. The ambient noise of the country club seemed to fade into a dull hum. I looked at my father, watching him practically hyperventilate over the arrival of his supreme leader, David Mitchell, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Financial. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I reached into my clutch and let my fingers brush against the cold metal of my platinum corporate card. The card bore the name Aegis Equity. It was the holding company I had founded and grown into a massive tech juggernaut. What my father did not know, what no one in this room knew, was that Vanguard Financial had been struggling for months. They had quietly sought a buyout to avoid complete bankruptcy. Just this morning, sitting in my penthouse office overlooking the Chicago skyline, I had signed the final acquisition papers. Aegis Equity now owned Vanguard Financial in its entirety. Furthermore, I had spent the afternoon reviewing the restructuring plans for the executive board. David Mitchell reported directly to me now. I watched my parents scramble to form a welcoming committee, frantically waving for Sydney to join them. "Let us all meet your boss," I thought quietly. "I am very much looking forward to this grand introduction today." The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open, and the entire atmosphere of the Oak Brook Country Club shifted instantly. The string quartet seemed to play a little softer, and the clinking of crystal glasses paused. David Mitchell had arrived. He was a man who carried his authority like a loaded weapon, walking with the crisp, arrogant stride of someone used to entire boardrooms, standing at absolute attention. My father practically vibrated with desperate energy. Thomas smoothed his lapels, plastered a sycophantic smile across his face, and lunged forward to intercept his boss before anyone else could make a favorable impression. This promotion to regional director was the crowning achievement of my father's life. He had spent the last 2 months boasting to everyone in Chicago about his inevitable ascent to the top of the corporate ladder. Brenda immediately sprang into action. She grabbed Sydney by the wrist, pulling her forward like a prize poodle at a dog show. In her frantic rush to center her golden child, my mother drove her sharp elbow directly into my ribs, physically shoving me behind a tall floral arrangement. "Stay out of sight," she hissed under her breath, her eyes blazing with warning. "Do not embarrass us in front of Vanguard Financial's royalty." Sydney adjusted the bodice of her $5,000 Vera Wang gown, tossing her hair over her shoulder and projecting an air of practiced elegance. I simply smoothed the skirt of my unbranded black dress and stepped right back out from behind the flowers, positioning myself squarely in their peripheral vision. I was not going to miss a single second of this interaction. David Mitchell shook my father's hand, offering a polite but strained greeting. Thomas was talking a mile a minute, thanking David profusely for attending, praising Vanguard Financial's recent quarterly reports, and completely humiliating himself with his desperate fawning. David nodded along, his eyes scanning the room, clearly looking for an escape route from my father's overwhelming desperation. He looked like a man who regretted RSVPing to a subordinate's party. Brenda saw her opening and aggressively pushed Sydney forward, completely interrupting my father's monologue. "Mr. Mitchell, it is an absolute honor," my mother chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I am Brenda Thomas's wife, and this is our youngest daughter, Sydney. She is the founder of a highly successful luxury lifestyle brand. We are just so proud of her entrepreneurial spirit." David offered a tight, dismissive smile to Sydney, murmuring a generic pleasantry that clearly indicated he did not care about her boutique business. Then his eyes drifted past the golden child and landed squarely on me. I stood perfectly still, holding my champagne glass, meeting his gaze with absolute, unyielding authority. Brenda caught the direction of his stare. A flash of profound irritation crossed her face before she hastily attempted to control the narrative. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh and pointed a dismissive thumb in my direction. "And that is our eldest. She never amounted to much. A college dropout, unfortunately. Best to just ignore her. She is just here for the free food." The silence that followed was not merely awkward. It was absolute, suffocating terror. David Mitchell did not laugh at my mother's cruel joke. He did not offer a polite nod. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. A visible sheen of sweat broke out across his forehead, shining under the crystal chandeliers. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping hard into a passing waiter, entirely ignoring the champagne that splashed onto his expensive Italian shoes. His eyes darted from my face down to his phone, which he clutched with white knuckles, and then back up to me, his jaw actually dropping open. "Ms. Lawson, David stammered, his voice cracking loudly in the quiet room. What are you doing here? Thomas let out a loud booming laugh, completely misreading the room and assuming this was some sort of humorous misunderstanding. He clapped David on the shoulder, missing the way the CEO violently flinched at the physical contact. You know my daughter, David, small world. Do not worry about her, she just does some basic computer work from her apartment. Nothing you need to concern yourself with tonight. David looked at my father as if Thomas had just announced he was a space alien. The CEO of Vanguard Financial actually recoiled from my father's touch, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. He looked frantically at the surrounding guests, then back at his employee. Thomas. David choked out, his voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated panic. Are you out of your mind? Your daughter is the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Equity. Her holding company bought Vanguard Financial 5 years ago. She signs my paycheck. She owns the entire firm. The heavy crystal champagne flute slipped from my father's hand. It hit the marble floor with a deafening crash, shattering into 100 glittering pieces, sending expensive liquor splashing across my mother's designer shoes. Nobody moved. The surrounding country club guests, who had been eavesdropping on the exchange, stood frozen in shock. Brenda's mouth hung open in a grotesque caricature of disbelief, her carefully constructed high society persona completely shattered. Sydney looked frantically between me and the terrified CEO, trying to comprehend how the spotlight had been so violently ripped away from her expensive gown. Thomas stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of sheer horror and desperate denial. His mouth opened and closed silently several times before he finally managed to force out a sound. You own the firm, he whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant boom. You bought Vanguard. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the room was sharp enough to cut glass. I looked my father dead in the eye, dropping the deferential daughter act I had played for 34 years. I did not want to ruin the surprise, Dad, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the grand foyer. Especially since I canceled your promotion at exactly 4 p.m. today. My father's face contorted from shock into a mask of pure, ugly rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar as the reality of my words crashed into him. He stepped toward me, his hands balled into tight fists, completely forgetting that he was standing in the middle of his beloved country club, surrounded by his elite peers. You are lying. Thomas spat, his voice echoing harshly off the vaulted ceiling. There is absolutely no way a failure like you could acquire a firm like Vanguard. You either hacked into their corporate network, or you slept your way into some executive's office. You are nothing but a fraud trying to ruin the most important night of my career. I will have security arrest you for corporate espionage right now. David Mitchell practically shoved my father backwards. The CEO looked as though he might have a massive heart attack right there on the Persian rug. Shut your mouth, Thomas, David hissed, his eyes darting frantically between my father and me. Are you actively trying to get us both destroyed? Ms. Lawson is the sole owner of Aegis Equity. I spent 3 grueling hours on a video conference with her legal team this morning reviewing the merger details. She is the absolute boss. Show some respect before she liquidates this entire branch and leaves us all unemployed. My father staggered back as if he had been physically struck. The air rushed out of his lungs, leaving him gaping like a stranded fish. He looked at David, then at me, the terrifying truth finally penetrating his arrogant skull. But before the total devastation of losing his promotion could fully register on his face, my mother swooped in. Brenda did not care about Thomas or his canceled promotion or the humiliation he was currently suffering. Her mind had quickly latched onto a single glittering word: billionaire. In the blink of an eye, the absolute disgust on my mother's face vanished, replaced by a grotesque, hungry smile. She lunged forward and grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my sleeve with terrifying strength. She looked at me as if I were a winning lottery ticket she had just discovered in the trash. The heavy scent of her expensive floral perfume washed over me, thick and suffocating. A billionaire! Brenda gasped, her voice shrill and vibrating with sudden desperate affection. Oh, honey, that is absolutely wonderful. I always knew you had a secret talent hidden away. This changes everything for us. You can finally step up and support your family the way you were always supposed to. I stared down at her hand gripping my arm. The sudden whiplash from calling me a worthless dropout to calling me honey gave me a profound sense of nausea. I did not move. I just waited for the inevitable demand. It took less than 10 seconds for her true intentions to surface. Sydney has been under so much stress lately with her business, my mother babbled, pulling her golden child forward by the wrist. You know how hard she works on her lifestyle brand. The bank is being incredibly unreasonable about her business loan, but now you can just take care of it. We need you to write a check for $1.5 million tonight to clear her debt. It is just pocket change for you now. We are family after all, and family helps family. Sydney stood there in her $5,000 gown, looking at me with a mixture of intense jealousy and arrogant expectation. She crossed her arms, shifting her weight from one expensive heel to the other, clearly waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and fund her vanity project exactly like our parents had funded her entire existence. I looked at my mother's eager, greedy face. I reached down and methodically peeled her fingers off my arm one by one, pushing her hand firmly back to her side. I took a half step back, putting a physical boundary between my success and their toxicity. Family, I repeated, keeping my tone deadly calm. You want to talk about family obligations. You want to talk about writing checks for the people we love. We sacrificed everything for you. Brenda shrieked, her fake smile slipping just enough to reveal the absolute entitlement beneath it. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. We clothed you and fed you. You owe us this money to save your sister. You owe this family. I took a step closer to my mother, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. You sacrificed nothing for me, Mom, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, dangerous edge that made the surrounding country club guests lean in closer to listen. But I remember exactly what you sacrificed for Sydney. Do you want to discuss what happened the summer I turned 20? Because I remember walking into the downtown bank branch to check the college savings account I had been putting my waitress tips into since I was 15 years old. My mother's face suddenly went rigid. The greedy gleam in her eyes flickered into genuine wide-eyed panic. She took a quick step backward, shaking her head. I remember the bank teller looking at me with pity. I continued, speaking clearly, so every single one of my father's colleagues could hear the truth. I remember her handing me a printed statement and telling me the account was completely empty. $84,320. Gone. And when I demanded to know how that was possible, the bank manager pulled the withdrawal slip. You forged my signature, Mom. You committed felony fraud to empty my entire college fund just so you could buy Sydney a brand new Mercedes for her sorority rush week. Brenda stumbled back, her hand flying to her throat as if she were choking. The surrounding crowd began to murmur loudly, the wealthy elite of Chicago, suddenly very interested in the criminal behavior of the woman who usually judged their outfits and gossiped about their children. That was different. Brenda stammered, her voice pitching into a panicked, high-pitched whine. Sydney needed reliable transportation for networking. You were just taking useless art and computer classes. It was an investment in her future. Look at the business she built. She is a successful CEO, too. Sydney immediately puffed out her chest, preparing to launch into a defense of her supposed entrepreneurial genius. She opened her mouth, ready to play the victim and demand the $1.5 million as if it were her divine birthright. But before Sydney could utter a single syllable of her rehearsed sales pitch, a deep, resonant voice echoed from the back of the foyer, cutting through the tension like a steel blade. Sydney does not have a lifestyle brand. She has a shell company. The crowd parted instantly. Isaiah, Sydney's husband, stepped forward into the center of the marble floor. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, looking completely unfazed by the sea of wealthy country club members staring at him. He walked with the calm, measured precision of a man who dealt exclusively in hard facts, undeniable numbers, and absolute truth. As a top-tier forensic accountant, Isaiah was the only person in this family who actually understood how the real world operated. He stopped right next to me, holding a thick, heavily tabbed manila folder in his right hand. He did not look at my parents. His eyes were locked entirely on the golden child. I ran a compliance check on my wife's business. Isaiah stated, his voice carrying the calm authority of a judge delivering a final verdict. He dropped the thick manila folder onto the nearest cocktail table with a heavy thud that made the crystal champagne flutes rattle. The wealthy country club crowd, previously whispering in hushed, scandalized tones, fell completely silent. They were absolutely captivated by the destruction of the Oak Brook elite unfolding right in front of them. Isaiah did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply opened the folder and began extracting spreadsheets heavily marked with red ink. Sydney stared at the documents, the color rapidly draining from her perfectly contoured face. Her hands gripped the fabric of her expensive gown so tightly her knuckles turned white. For the past 3 years, Isaiah continued, his eyes locked entirely on his panicking wife. You have told everyone that your luxury cosmetics brand is expanding globally. You told your parents you needed continuous capital injections to secure warehouse space, fund international marketing campaigns, and pay for premium manufacturing. But there is no warehouse. The address you provided for your corporate headquarters is a post office box in Delaware. Your cosmetics are cheap drop-shipped products that cost pennies to make, and your sales revenue has been virtually non-existent since day one. My father's face contorted in confusion. Thomas took a step toward his son-in-law, aggressively waving his hand. What are you talking about? We have seen her marketing materials. We know she is successful. We gave her that loan because she was expanding into European markets. Isaiah picked up a bank statement and held it up for my father to see. She did not expand into Europe, Thomas. She took your retirement money and funneled it directly into a series of private checking accounts. She has been running a textbook Ponzi scheme on her own parents. Do you remember the $75,000 she asked for last year to secure a distribution contract with major retailers? That money never went to a distributor. It paid for the Vera Wang gown she is wearing right now. The $500,000 you wired her last month for a supposed product launch paid for first-class flights to Dubai for her and her influencer friends, a lease on a new Porsche, and thousands of dollars in fake social media followers to keep up the illusion. She even fabricated emails from non-existent marketing directors to keep the cash flowing. I watched the devastating truth land squarely in the center of the room. Isaiah systematically laid out the receipts. He exposed the forged vendor invoices Sydney had created on her laptop. He detailed the fake expense reports she used to keep my parents writing check after check. She had drained their liquid assets dry to maintain a hollow, extravagant lifestyle she could never actually afford. A normal parent would have been outraged. A normal father would have demanded his money back. A normal mother would have been horrified by her daughter's blatant, calculated deception. But Thomas and Brenda were not normal parents. They had spent their entire lives treating Sydney as an infallible deity, and they were completely incapable of processing her profound failure. Instead of turning on the daughter who had just robbed them blind, my parents immediately turned their vicious anger onto Isaiah. Thomas marched forward, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, pointing an aggressive finger directly at his son-in-law. "How dare you look into our family finances?" he roared, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. "You had absolutely no right to audit my daughter without my permission. You were always jealous of her success. You are just a bitter number cruncher trying to ruin her reputation because you cannot handle being married to a powerful, independent woman. You have no idea how venture capitalism works." Brenda rushed forward and wrapped her arms around Sydney, pulling her golden child into a protective embrace as if Isaiah had physically attacked them. She glared at him with absolute venom. "Leave her alone," Brenda shrieked. "She is just a creative soul. She is an artist and a visionary. So what if she made a little mistake with her bookkeeping? Entrepreneurs have to take risks to build an empire. You simply do not understand the intense pressure she is under to succeed in the business world." The sheer delusion radiating from my parents was staggering. They had just been told their favorite child had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars of their retirement funds to buy handbags and plane tickets, and their immediate instinct was to blame the man who handed them the unassailable evidence. The country club guests were whispering feverishly behind their hands, watching a respected executive defend the very person who had just defrauded him. I stood there perfectly still, taking a slow sip of my champagne. I was utterly fascinated by the mental gymnastics happening right in front of me, perfectly content to let Isaiah completely dismantle their manufactured reality. Emboldened by her parents' absurd defense, Sydney immediately shifted into her favorite role, the victim. She buried her face in her hands and forced out a loud theatrical sob. She looked at Isaiah through her fingers, squeezing out fresh crocodile tears perfectly designed to garner sympathy from the wealthy onlookers. "How could you do this to me, Isaiah?" Sydney cried, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. "I am your wife. We are supposed to be a team. I trusted you with my business accounts, and you used them to humiliate me in front of all these important people. You are embarrassing me in front of my family and my friends. You need to apologize to me right now." Isaiah did not flinch. His expression remained as cold and unyielding as a glacier. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He did not pull out a handkerchief to wipe away her fake tears. Instead, he pulled out a sleek silver pen and a second, much thinner document. He set it down gently on top of the pile of fraudulent bank statements. "I am not embarrassing you, Sydney," Isaiah said, his voice dropping to a low, devastating register that commanded absolute attention. "I am leaving you. I filed the divorce papers an hour ago, and the IRS already has these files." Sydney's perfectly sculpted face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The delicate, elegant facade of the helpless victim vanished instantly, replaced by the vicious, spoiled child she had always been beneath the surface. With a guttural shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom, she reared back and hurled her crystal champagne flute directly at Isaiah's head. He anticipated the childish outburst. With a smooth, practiced tilt of his shoulders, he sidestepped the flying glass. It sailed past his ear and shattered violently against a marble pillar, raining expensive vintage champagne and jagged crystal shards onto the antique Persian rug. Guests gasped and stepped back in unison, murmuring in shocked, scandalized tones as Sydney stamped her designer heel, her chest heaving with rage. Brenda did not bother reprimanding her golden child for the violent, unhinged outburst. She did not even look at Isaiah as he turned on his heel and walked calmly toward the exit, leaving his fraudulent wife to face the music alone. Instead, my mother whipped her head back toward me, her eyes manic and wild. The greed that had illuminated her face just moments before had now mutated into a frantic, terrifying desperation. She lunged forward, her claw-like hands grasping at the air between us. "Sienna, you have to fix this!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing painfully in the quiet room. She was completely ignoring the fact that her favorite daughter had just been exposed as a federal criminal who had stolen her own retirement funds. "You heard him. The IRS is involved. Sydney could go to federal prison. You are a billionaire. You own Vanguard Financial. You have endless resources. You need to hire the best defense attorneys in the country and pay off whatever penalties she owes right now. You have to save her brand." I looked at my mother, genuinely marveling at her absolute detachment from reality. She had just been robbed blind by the daughter she worshipped, and her immediate instinct was to demand that the daughter she despised foot the bill to cover it up. I took a slow, deliberate step back, crossing my arms over my chest, and putting a firm physical boundary between my success and her chaotic toxicity. "I will not be spending a single cent of my money to rescue a fraud," I stated, my voice ringing with cold, unyielding finality. "Sydney dug this grave all by herself, and she can bury herself in it. I am not your personal bank, and I am certainly not her savior." Brenda's jaw dropped. A dark, ugly red flush crept up her neck, mottling her heavily powdered skin. "You selfish, ungrateful brat!" she screamed, spittle flying from her lips as she completely lost the last shreds of her carefully cultivated country club decorum. "How can you stand there and watch your own sister's life be destroyed? We sacrificed everything for you. We kept a solid roof over your head. We clothed you and fed you for 18 years. You owe us your absolute loyalty. We are blood." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power never has to shout. I reached into my small black clutch and withdrew a worn pocket-sized leather ledger. It was the exact same ledger I had kept since I was a teenager, the one where I had meticulously tracked every single shift I worked, every hour of grueling overtime, and every single dollar I saved while my parents were busy funding Sydney's glamorous lifestyle. I flipped the small book open to a dog-eared page, running my finger down the faded ink. "I owe you absolutely nothing," I said, looking up to meet Brenda's furious glare. "But let us talk about what you owe me. When I was 20 years old, you walked into the downtown bank branch and forged my signature on a withdrawal slip. You drained exactly $84,320 from my college savings account." Brenda flinched, taking a sudden step backward as the crowd murmured collectively. "That was money I scrubbed floors and waited tables to earn." I continued, making sure my voice carried to the back of the room. "You stole my entire future just so you could buy Sydney a luxury car for her sorority rush week. And when I confronted you about the theft, you told me I was not smart enough for college anyway, and that I should just be happy contributing to the family image. I built Aegis Equity with zero help from you. I paid for my own life. You do not get to claim my success now just because your fraudulent golden child is facing a federal indictment." My father, having stood in a state of catatonic shock for the last several minutes, suddenly snapped out of his stupor. Thomas realized his entire world was collapsing around him. His boss was terrified of me. His favorite daughter was going to prison, and his wife was publicly screaming like a banshee in front of the very people he had spent months trying to impress. He needed to reclaim his patriarchal authority, and he needed to do it immediately to salvage whatever was left of his pride. He puffed out his chest, squaring his shoulders as he marched toward me, his face twisted in desperate anger. "That is enough," Thomas bellowed, trying to summon the booming, authoritative voice he used to intimidate his subordinates. "I will not have you disrespecting your mother and sister in public. You are lying about the bank account, and you are lying about owning Vanguard. This is just another one of your pathetic attention-seeking stunts. I am done dealing with your jealousy." He turned his back on me and dramatically waved his arm toward the heavy mahogany doors at the entrance of the ballroom. "Security." Thomas roared, his voice echoing across the silent crowd. "Security. Get over here immediately. I am a platinum member of the Oakbrook Country Club, and I demand that this lying, disruptive woman be removed from the premises at once. She is trespassing and harassing my family." A tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp, dark security suit immediately separated from the crowd near the entrance. He walked briskly across the polished marble floor, his expression serious and professional. Thomas smirked, crossing his arms and looking at me with a triumphant, condescending glare, clearly believing he had finally put me back in my place. "Right here," Officer Thomas barked, pointing a rigid, shaking finger directly at my face. "Escort her out right now before I press formal trespassing charges." The head of security did not even look at my father. He walked straight past Thomas's outstretched arm and stopped directly in front of me. The imposing man clasped his hands respectfully in front of him and offered a deep, formal bow. "Is there a problem, Ms. Lawson?" the head of security asked smoothly, completely ignoring my father's frantic sputtering. "Do you need these guests escorted off the property?" Thomas froze, his arm dropping limply to his side. He looked at the security guard, then at me, his eyes wide with profound, paralyzing confusion. "But I am a platinum member," Thomas whispered weakly, his voice breaking. "I pay my dues." David Mitchell, the CEO of Vanguard Financial, had been standing absolutely paralyzed near the floral arrangement throughout the entire ordeal. He took a hesitant step forward and leaned in close to my father's ear, his face pale and shining with sweat. His voice trembled as he delivered the final crushing blow. Thomas David whispered his words, carrying clearly in the dead silence of the room. "She does not just own Vanguard. She bought the country club's real estate last month." The silence in the grand ballroom became so absolute that the gentle hum of the crystal chandeliers sounded like a roaring engine. Thomas stared at David Mitchell, his mouth working silently as the CEO's words filtered through his panicked brain. He looked at the head of security, who was still bowing slightly in my direction, awaiting my command. I gave the guard a brief nod, dismissing him, and he immediately stepped back, folding his hands behind his back and standing at attention like my personal Praetorian guard. The sickly gray pallor of my father's face rapidly transformed into a deep, volatile purple. The veins at his temples throbbed violently against his skin. Every foundational belief he held about the world, his supremacy, his intellect, his undeniable superiority over his eldest daughter, was being systematically dismantled in front of the most powerful people in Chicago. Stripped of his authority, abandoned by his security, and humiliated by his boss, Thomas resorted to the only tactic he had left: emotional manipulation wrapped in suffocating patriarchal arrogance. He forcibly smoothed his expression, attempting to stretch his lips into a grotesque, patronizing smile. He took a step toward me, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, as if trying to calm a hysterical child. "Sienna, let us be reasonable here," he began, his voice thick with unearned condescension. "This is a tremendous amount of responsibility." Aegis Equity Vanguard Financial Country Club Real Estate. It is simply too much for one person to oversee, especially a young woman. You have done a cute job building this little tech thing, but managing corporate assets of this magnitude requires a seasoned executive. It requires a heavy hand. Women do not know how to handle this level of capital. You need me. As the head of this family, I am willing to step in and properly manage these assets. We will have your legal team draft an agreement signing 50% of your shares over to me right now. It is the only way to protect your wealth. I looked at the man who had ignored my existence for 3 decades. A sharp, bright laugh erupted from my chest. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a cold, piercing sound of pure disbelief that echoed across the marble foyer. The sheer audacity of his delusion was almost admirable. 50% of my shares, I repeated, stepping directly into his personal space, forcing him to look me in the eye. You want to manage my capital because I am a woman who cannot handle it. Let me tell you exactly how I handled it, Dad. When you kicked me out for dropping out of law school, I moved into a freezing, unheated one-bedroom apartment above a noisy laundromat in the worst neighborhood in the city. I spent 18 hours a day coding financial algorithms until my fingers bled. I ate cheap noodles and slept on an air mattress for 2 years. I built a fintech empire from absolute scratch, without a single cent of seed money or a single investor holding my hand. I pointed a firm finger at his chest, tapping the expensive silk of his tailored suit. While I was doing that, you were taking out a high-interest second mortgage on the family home, just so you could buy a set of custom-engraved Titleist golf clubs and pay your exorbitant membership dues here at Oakbrook. You are drowning in consumer debt to maintain the illusion of wealth while I actually own the ground you are standing on. You are not a seasoned executive, Thomas. You are a glorified middle manager who has survived on golf course networking and stolen credit. You have absolutely nothing to offer me. The patronizing smile slid right off my father's face, replaced by a mask of feral, desperate rage. He realized the paternal manipulation was utterly useless. His fists clenched at his sides, his breathing ragged and heavy. The facade of the caring father vanished entirely, revealing the cornered, vicious man underneath. "Fine!" Thomas spat, his voice dropping into a vicious, threatening snarl. "If you want to play hardball, we will play hardball. I have worked at Vanguard Financial for 15 years. I have dedicated my life to that firm. You think you can just march in here and humiliate me? If you do not reinstate my promotion to regional director right this second, I will sue you and your entire holding company into oblivion. I will file a massive lawsuit for age discrimination, wrongful termination, and creating a hostile work environment. I know the labor laws in this state, Sienna. I will drag your pristine new acquisition through years of grueling public litigation. Give me my promotion back, or I will destroy your corporate reputation before you even sign the final integration paperwork." He stood there panting, chest puffed out fully, believing he had backed me into a legal corner. He thought he still held the cards. He thought he could bully me the same way he bullied my mother and everyone else who crossed his path. David Mitchell let out a small squeak of terror, terrified that my father's outburst would bring the wrath of Aegis Equity down upon the entire Vanguard executive board. I did not blink. I reached into my leather tote bag sitting on the nearby floral pedestal. I bypassed my phone and my wallet. my fingers closing around a thick, glossy document I had prepared precisely for this moment. I pulled out a heavy Vanguard financial folder, distinctively marked with a bright red tab indicating severe corporate priority. I held it up between us, letting the gold-embossed Vanguard logo catch the light of the chandeliers. "Sue me," I asked, tilting my head and offering him a devastating, predatory smile. "Dad, you really are not paying attention. I did not just cancel your promotion today. The minute the ink dried on the acquisition papers, I triggered a massive retroactive forensic audit on your specific branch. Care to explain the $400,000 missing from the client escrow accounts?" The number hung in the air, heavy and lethal. $400,000. Thomas's face, already flushed a deep, volatile purple, twisted into a mask of feral panic. The thin veneer of the sophisticated country club gentleman completely evaporated, revealing the cornered, desperate fraud underneath. With a guttural sound that was half roar and half sob, he lunged across the polished marble floor. His hands clawed toward the red-tabbed folder in my grip, desperate to destroy the physical evidence of his crimes before anyone else could read it. He did not make it within 3 feet of me. Isaiah moved with a quiet, lethal grace that completely belied his profession as a forensic accountant. He stepped smoothly between us, planting his feet firmly and catching my father by the shoulders. Isaiah did not throw a punch, but the sudden, immovable wall of his physical presence completely halted my father's momentum. Thomas crashed into Isaiah's chest and bounced back, stumbling awkwardly over his own expensive dress shoes. Isaiah simply smoothed the lapels of his tailored navy suit, completely unbothered, acting as an impenetrable human shield between my father's frantic rage and my cold reality. I did not even flinch. I slowly flipped open the heavy cardstock cover of the Vanguard financial folder, smoothing my hand down the first page of the forensic audit. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, save for my father's ragged, heavy breathing. I cleared my throat, projecting my voice so every single wealthy guest, every waiter, and every country club board member could hear the exact price of my family's fake perfection. "Let us look at the ledger, shall we?" I announced, scanning the top row of highlighted figures. On October 12th of last year, $65,000 was transferred from the Peterson client escrow account into a dummy corporate vendor file. Strangely enough, that exact same amount cleared a luxury car dealership the very next morning to cover the balloon payment on Sydney's leased Porsche. I turned the page, not waiting for a response, letting the facts hang in the quiet room. Moving on to February 4th. $80,000 vanished from the Vanguard Senior Municipal Bond Fund. That money was washed through a fake consulting invoice and deposited directly into a private checking account. An account that was immediately used to settle a massive delinquent tab right here at the Oak Brook Country Club. I looked up from the paper-locking eyes with my mother. Brenda was gripping the edge of a cocktail table, her knuckles stark white against her heavily manicured hands. "That was a very expensive winter luncheon season for you, Mom," I said, my voice dripping with cold, clinical precision. "The ice sculptures, the imported caviar, the custom champagne flutes. You funded your entire high society socialite persona with the retirement savings of elderly Vanguard clients." I flipped to the final summary page. "And the crown jewel of your corporate theft, Dad. Just last month, you siphoned $150,000 from a corporate tax holding account to bail out Sydney's failing lifestyle brand before her creditors could seize her inventory. You stole from the hardworking people who trusted you to manage their futures, all to finance a pathetic, hollow illusion." David Mitchell, who had been listening to my recitation with his mouth hanging open in sheer horror, suddenly snapped to life. As the chief executive officer of Vanguard Financial, he realized exactly what this public revelation meant for his own career and the firm's liability. The fear of my holding company liquidating his position and freezing his assets completely overrode any corporate loyalty he had to my father. David spun around to face Thomas, his eyes wide and panicked, looking for someone to throw under the bus to save his own skin. "You stole from Vanguard clients!" David screamed, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of the scandal. "You embezzled corporate funds right under my nose. I trusted you with that branch. You told me those accounts were underperforming because of market volatility. You lied to my face. Thomas tried to reach out to his boss, his hands trembling violently. David, wait. I can explain everything. It was just a temporary reallocation of resources. I was going to put it back before the quarterly review. David violently swatted my father's hand away as if his fingers were coated in acid. There is no explaining this, Thomas. You are done. You are completely finished in this industry. You are terminated, effective immediately. Do not even bother going back to the office to clean out your desk. The finality of David's words echoed through the grand foyer. My father, the proud patriarch, the man who had demanded my absolute subservience for 3 decades, stood entirely broken in the center of the room. But the real shock came from my mother. Brenda did not rush forward to comfort her husband of 35 years. She did not express horror or moral outrage at the fact that the man she loved had stolen the life savings of innocent people. Her reaction was purely terrifyingly selfish. She stared at Thomas, her face twisted in absolute disgust, treating him like a piece of garbage that had just ruined her party. You got caught. Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the marble. How could you be so incredibly stupid? You promised me those transfers were completely untraceable. If you lose your salary and your corporate accounts, how are we going to pay the country club dues next month? How am I supposed to show my face at the charity gala? You ruined everything. She did not care about the crime. She only cared that the money hose had been permanently shut off. Thomas was cornered. His boss had just fired him. His wife was screaming at him about country club dues instead of offering support. His son-in-law had physically neutralized him, and his ultimate failure of a daughter held his entire fate in her hands. With nowhere left to run, and his ego completely shattered, Thomas fell back on arrogant, blinding denial. He straightened his ruined posture, his chest heaving, his face a mask of feral, sweaty desperation. He pointed a shaking finger at me, spitting his words with toxic venom. You have absolutely no proof. Thomas snarled, his voice tight and hoarse. Those papers mean nothing. You printed them out yourself just to humiliate me in front of my friends. These are entirely fabricated documents. You are a bitter, jealous little girl who could not handle the fact that Sydney is the successful one. Nobody here believes a single word you are saying. I have the best corporate lawyers in Chicago on retainer. They have kept this family safe for decades. I will sue you for defamation. I will sue you for slander. I will drag you through the courts until you are begging for mercy on the sidewalk. You cannot do this to me. I watched him unravel, entirely unimpressed by his hollow, frantic threats. The sheer panic in his eyes completely betrayed the aggressive posture he was trying to project. I reached up slowly, my index finger brushing against the discreet wireless earpiece tucked beneath my hair. I pressed the small button, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction wash over me as I heard the confirmation tone click in my ear. I looked back at my father, dropping the Vanguard folder onto the table right next to Isaiah's divorce documents. You might want to rethink that, I said. The heavy mahogany doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open with a resounding thud. The entire crowd turned in unison as 3 individuals stepped over the threshold. They were dressed in immaculate, razor-sharp tailored suits, moving with a synchronized, predatory precision that commanded immediate attention. The trio marched directly across the ballroom floor, their leather shoes clicking ominously against the marble, parting the sea of wealthy guests effortlessly. Sienna did not flinch. She simply offered a cold, terrifyingly serene smile. Allow me to introduce the legal team of Aegis Equity, she announced, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. They have been waiting in the lobby for my signal. I believe they have some paperwork for you, Thomas. The lead attorney, a tall woman with severe, steel-gray hair and eyes like chipped ice, stepped directly in front of my father. She did not introduce herself or offer a handshake. She simply thrust a thick, heavily sealed envelope against his chest, forcing him to take it or let it fall. Thomas Lawson, the attorney, stated, her voice projecting absolute authority. You are being served with an immediate cease and desist order regarding any further transactions within Vanguard Financial. Furthermore, This serves as your formal notification of intent to sue for corporate fraud, grand larceny, and embezzlement of client funds. Thomas clutched the envelope with trembling hands, his face completely drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but the attorney was not finished. Additionally, she continued, her gaze sweeping over both Thomas and Brenda with clinical disgust. I am informing you that your personal checking, savings, and investment accounts have been temporarily frozen across all banking institutions. This immediate asset freeze has been mandated pending the ongoing federal investigation initiated by the IRS. Brenda let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. Frozen, she shrieked, clutching her pearl necklace as if the lawyer had physically assaulted her. What do you mean, frozen? We have bills. We have galas to attend. You cannot just take our money. It is not your money, Brenda Sienna interjected smoothly, taking a step forward. That is the entire point. You have been living off stolen funds, and now the federal government is reclaiming it. The attorney nodded in agreement, turning her attention back to Thomas. The IRS was highly compelled by the extensive forensic documentation provided by your son-in-law, Isaiah. While investigating your daughter's fraudulent corporate filings, he uncovered the massive discrepancies in your branch's escrow accounts and handed the entire data package over to federal authorities an hour ago. You are entirely boxed in, Mr. Lawson. You have zero access to Capital Zero legal standing and zero leverage. Have a good evening. The three lawyers stepped back, forming a solid, intimidating wall behind Sienna. Thomas staggered backward, hitting the edge of a cocktail table. He looked down at his phone, his thumb frantically swiping across the screen. A loud, pathetic whimper escaped his throat as he saw the bright red error messages confirming his zeroed-out balances. His empire, his country club status, his stolen wealth, everything was gone in the blink of an eye. Sydney watched the destruction of her parents with wide, panicked eyes. The absolute reality of her situation finally crashed down upon her. The bank of Thomas and Brenda was permanently closed. Her luxury cosmetic scam was dead. She was facing a federal indictment, and her parents could not even afford to buy her a cup of coffee, let alone a high-powered defense attorney. With the predatory instincts of a desperate animal, Sydney instantly abandoned her sinking family. She realized there was only one person left in the room who possessed the stability and resources to potentially save her. She pivoted sharply away from her ruined parents and turned back toward the man she had spent the last 3 years deceiving. Isaiah had remained standing perfectly still near the shattered remains of the champagne flute Sydney had thrown at his head. He watched her approach with an expression of absolute unyielding stone. Sydney did not just walk over to him. She threw herself at him. She dropped heavily to her knees right there on the champagne-soaked Persian rug, completely uncaring that the sticky liquid and glass shards were ruining her expensive Vera Wang gown. She grabbed the hem of Isaiah's tailored suit jacket, her knuckles white with desperation. The vicious spoiled brat vanished, replaced instantly by the ultimate hysterical victim. "Isaiah, please!" Sydney wailed, her voice cracking as fresh theatrical tears streamed down her perfectly contoured face. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot just leave me here with them. I am your wife. We took vows. You are supposed to protect me." Isaiah did not move a muscle. He stared down at her hands, gripping his jacket, then slowly shifted his gaze to her tear-streaked face. He said absolutely nothing, letting her dig her hole even deeper in front of the silent, captivated audience. Sensing that her usual tears were not working, Sydney shifted to a darker, much more manipulative tactic. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with manufactured heartbreak, deciding to play her ultimate trump card, to guilt-trip him into submission. "I sacrificed everything for you," Sydney sobbed loudly, making sure her voice echoed off the marble pillars. "I lowered my social standing to marry you. You know how my friends judged me. You know how this country club whispered about us behind our backs. They looked down on you, but I defended you. I brought you into my world. I gave you access to this life. I took the stigma and the judgment from my own community because I loved you. You owe me for that sacrifice. You cannot abandon me after everything I gave up to be with you." The room collectively sucked in a breath at the blatant, ugly manipulation. Sydney was blatantly weaponizing race and class, trying to twist her fraudulent parasitic existence into some kind of noble martyrdom. She clung to his jacket, crying hysterically, waiting for the guilt to wash over his face. Isaiah looked down at her with absolute ice in his eyes. There was no anger, no sadness, and absolutely no pity. He reached over with his right hand and calmly pried her clutching fingers off his suit jacket, letting her hands drop to her sides. "You did not sacrifice anything," Sydney Isaiah stated, his voice a low, devastating rumble that carried through the dead silent ballroom. "You married me because my credit score was 800 and yours was 420. He reached for his left hand, his fingers grasping the heavy platinum wedding band. With a smooth, effortless motion, he slid the ring off his finger and dropped it directly onto the table next to the fraudulent bank statements. The heavy metal hit the glass tabletop with a sharp, final clink. Sydney stared at the platinum ring resting against the fraudulent bank statements. The absolute finality of the metallic clink seemed to short-circuit her brain. For a split second, the ballroom was trapped in a suffocating vacuum of silence. Then a visceral, ear-piercing scream ripped its way out of Sydney's throat. It was not a cry of genuine heartbreak or lost love. It was the terrifying, unhinged shriek of a spoiled child realizing that her ultimate safety net had just evaporated into thin air. She clawed at the air, her face contorted into an ugly mask of raw, unfiltered panic. Isaiah did not offer her a second glance. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, turned his back on the screaming woman he had once called his wife, and walked away. He crossed the marble floor with calm, deliberate steps, moving directly toward my side of the ballroom. When he reached me, he turned around and crossed his arms, standing shoulder to shoulder with me and my legal team. He had officially and publicly defected. The battle lines were permanently drawn, and my sister was entirely on her own. Brenda watched Isaiah seamlessly align himself with my wealth and power, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. She slowly turned her head to look at Thomas. My father was leaning heavily against a cocktail table, his chest heaving, his face a terrifying shade of ashen gray. He was ruined. David Mitchell had just terminated his career, and the federal authorities were currently dissecting his entire professional existence. Brenda's manic eyes darted rapidly around the room, taking in the whispering country club elites, the stone-faced corporate lawyers, and the absolute destruction of her carefully curated high society life. The crushing reality finally penetrated Brenda's impenetrable wall of delusion. The money was gone. There would be no more extravagant charity galas. There would be no more imported caviar luncheons. Thomas was going to federal prison, and her golden child was facing a massive IRS indictment. The infinite fountain of stolen wealth they had happily guzzled from was permanently dry. Brenda's haughty, aristocratic posture completely collapsed. The woman who had spent 30 years looking down her nose at me, treating me like a burdensome servant in my own home, suddenly crumbled. She let out a desperate, ragged sob and threw herself onto the floor right next to Sydney. Her designer dress pooled around her as she scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the spilled champagne soaking into the fabric. She crawled directly toward my feet, her hands reaching out in a pathetic display of absolute submission. "Sienna, please!" Brenda wailed, her voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated terror. "You have to stop this. You have to call off your lawyers. You have to pay David Mitchell whatever he wants to give your father his job back. We have nothing left. If the federal government seizes our accounts, we will lose everything. You cannot let your own family drown. We will be on the streets, Sienna. Please." I did not step back. I did not flinch away from her grasping hands. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had happily forged my signature to steal my college fund. The sheer irony of her groveling at the feet of the daughter she had deemed worthless was a masterpiece of poetic justice. I let her sob for a long, agonizing moment, allowing the entire ballroom to witness the ultimate humiliation of Brenda Lawson. Slowly, methodically, I crouched down. I smoothed the fabric of my skirt and knelt on the polished marble floor, bringing my face perfectly level with hers. My expression remained as cold and clinical as a surgeon examining a fascinating specimen. "Why would you be on the streets, Mom?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room. Brenda hiccuped, staring at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but I did not let her. Dad has been a regional director for 15 years. I continued, tilting my head in a display of manufactured innocence. He makes $300,000 a year in base salary alone, not including his quarterly bonuses. You live in a house that you proudly boast about at every single family gathering. The house has been paid off for a decade. Dad threw a massive party right here in this very ballroom 10 years ago to celebrate burning the mortgage papers. You have zero debt on that property. It is a completely liquid asset, so why would you be on the streets? Thomas, hearing my words through his veil of panic, snapped his head up. He pushed himself off the cocktail table, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He nodded dumbly, grasping at the one remaining life raft he believed he possessed. "The house is secure," Thomas mumbled, his voice raspy and desperate. "It is in my name. I paid it off in 2014. We have equity. We can liquidate the estate. We can hire defense attorneys." I smiled. It was a razor-sharp, terrifying smile that caused Brenda to visibly recoil. I stood back up, towering over my kneeling mother. I reached into my glossy red-tabbed Vanguard financial folder one last time. I bypassed the corporate escrow audits and extracted a single heavily redacted document from a completely different banking institution. I held the crisp white paper up, letting the bright overhead lights illuminate the bold black ink. "Dad, didn't you know?" I asked, locking eyes with my father and letting my voice drip with mock sympathy. Thomas froze. His eyes darted to the paper in my hand, a fresh wave of primal dread washing over his features. "Know what?" he choked out. "Mom took out a secret second mortgage on the house 3 years ago," I announced, projecting my voice so the entire Oakbrook elite could hear every single devastating syllable. "She forged your signature on the loan applications using the exact same method she used to drain my college fund. She leveraged every single ounce of equity you had built in that property to secure a massive line of credit." Thomas stopped breathing. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. "And do you want to know where all that money went?" I continued, gesturing down at Sydney, who was now staring at her mother in horror. "It paid for Sydney's supposed business trips to Dubai. It paid for the first-class Emirates flights. It paid for the luxury yacht rentals to film her fake influencer content. It paid for the designer handbags she flaunted on social media to pretend she was a self-made millionaire. Mom drained your only remaining asset to fund a completely fraudulent lifestyle." Thomas processed the information with agonizing slowness. The absolute staggering betrayal committed by his own wife finally shattered the last remaining pieces of his sanity. He turned slowly toward Brenda. His eyes were wide with a violent, unadulterated rage that was genuinely terrifying to witness. "You mortgaged my house behind my back!" Thomas roared, his voice cracking with fury and disbelief. Brenda shrank back, trembling violently as she pressed herself against the floor. She raised her hands defensively, unable to formulate a single cohesive lie to save herself. "Thomas, I had to," she stammered, fresh tears ruining her expensive makeup. "Sydney needed the capital to launch her brand. It was an investment in our daughter's future. I was going to pay it back as soon as her cosmetics line took off. I was just trying to help her succeed." I looked down at the pathetic, broken remnants of my family. They had destroyed each other in their desperate, greedy pursuit of a fake reality. I smoothed the document in my hand and delivered the final lethal blow. "And since neither of you have made a payment on that secret mortgage in 8 months, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute unyielding finality, the bank foreclosed on it yesterday." The word "yesterday" hung in the dead air of the country club ballroom like a guillotine blade that had finally dropped. Thomas stared at me, his jaw slack, his brain entirely unable to process the sheer catastrophic magnitude of the destruction I had just laid at his feet. He slowly turned his head to look down at his wife. The woman he had fiercely defended, enabled and shielded from any accountability for over 3 decades, was currently cowering on the polished marble floor. The fragile, toxic alliance that had kept their marriage intact instantly disintegrated. The arrogant narcissist realized that his loyal enabler had fatally compromised his survival. Thomas lunged forward with a terrifying roar. He did not hit her, but he grabbed Brenda by the shoulders of her designer gown and hauled her roughly to her feet. He shook her so violently that her expensive diamond earrings clattered loudly against her collarbone. "You stupid, greedy, parasitic woman!" Thomas screamed, his voice raw, guttural, and completely unrecognizable. "You ruined me. You absolutely destroyed my career and my legacy. You forged my signature on a federal banking document to fund lip gloss and plane tickets for this spoiled brat. You traded our home, our entire life, our retirement for absolute garbage. I am going to federal prison because you could not stop spending money we did not have. You robbed me blind." Brenda did not cower for long. The primal instinct for self-preservation quickly overrode her initial panic. She ripped herself out of his aggressive grip, her carefully manicured nails clawing viciously at his wrists. She shoved him backward with surprising adrenaline-fueled force, her face twisting into an ugly, sneering mask of pure, unfiltered contempt. "Do not you dare put this failure on me!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. "I did what I had to do to maintain our status in this community. If you were half the man you constantly pretend to be, I would not have had to sneak behind your back to finance our lives." Brenda stepped towards him, jabbing a manicured finger into his chest, entirely uncaring that the entire country club elite was hanging on her every word. "You bragged constantly about your six-figure salary, but it was never enough to actually keep up with the Mitchells or the Vanderbilts. You wanted the prestigious country club life. You wanted to walk into this ballroom and have everyone bow down to your perceived wealth. But you were never man enough to actually provide the lifestyle we deserved. You were nothing but a weak middle management pencil pusher, and I had to fix your pathetic financial inadequacies so we did not look like absolute laughingstocks to our friends." The sheer unapologetic venom in her voice caused several wealthy onlookers to visibly recoil in horror. But the most violent and immediate reaction came from the golden child. Sydney, who was still kneeling in a puddle of spilled champagne and broken glass, suddenly realized the absolute severity of the criminal charges looming over her. The corporate fraud, the embezzlement, the secret second mortgage. Her entire glamorous lifestyle brand was built on stolen federal funds, and the IRS was already circling the carcass of her career. She desperately needed a scapegoat to offer the authorities, and her mother was bleeding out right in front of her. Sydney scrambled to her feet, wiping the theatrical tears from her face, replacing them with a look of vicious self-preservation. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Brenda's face. "You told me that money was from Dad's bonus!" Sydney screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical, desperate panic. "You told me Dad explicitly approved the marketing budget for my Dubai trip and the yacht rentals. I had no idea you were stealing from the house or forging documents. You set me up. You made me an unwitting accessory to your federal crimes. You are a liar, Mom. You lied to my face, and now I am going to federal prison because of your psychotic, pathetic obsession with impressing these country club snobs." That accusation snapped the very last frayed wire holding Brenda's mind together. The mother who had sacrificed absolutely everything, including her own neglected daughter's college fund and her husband's freedom to blindly worship her golden child, was suddenly being thrown straight to the wolves by that very same beloved child. With a guttural, animalistic shriek of pure rage, Brenda lunged forward. She raised her hand high and delivered a vicious, resounding slap directly across Sydney's face. The sharp, violent crack of flesh against flesh silenced the entire ballroom. Sydney stumbled backward, crying out in genuine shock, her hand flying up to clutch her rapidly reddening cheek. She stared at her mother in sheer terror. Brenda lunged again, grabbing a fistful of Sydney's hair, screaming incoherently. Thomas jumped into the fray, grabbing Brenda's waist to pull her off their daughter, resulting in all three of them crashing into a lavish dessert table. The perfect, untouchable Lawson family was physically tearing each other apart, rolling in cake and broken crystal in the middle of the Oak Brook Country Club. I watched the absolute chaos unfold with unyielding, terrifying serenity. I did not yell, I did not gloat, I did not move to intervene. I did not need to raise my voice to assert my dominance over them anymore. My complete silence was my ultimate power. I stood perfectly still, shoulder to shoulder with Isaiah, our arms brushing lightly, presenting a united, impenetrable front against their total destruction. We simply observed the carnage as the people who had tortured, belittled, and robbed me for 30 years methodically and publicly destroyed themselves. The country club guests were whispering frantically, many openly recording the physical altercation on their smartphones forever, immortalizing the humiliating, spectacular downfall of Thomas and Brenda Lawson. Eventually, the country club security guards rushed forward, physically separating the screaming, thrashing family members. Thomas was breathing heavily, his suit torn, his face scratched, watching his wife and daughter continue to scream at each other over the shattered remnants of their fake empire. He looked around the room, reading the absolute disgust, mockery, and pity on the faces of his former peers. His eyes darted to David Mitchell, who simply shook his head and turned his back in complete disgust. Thomas had no job, no money, no reputation, and no home. Suddenly, Thomas stopped yelling. His erratic, panicked breathing hitched violently as a brand new, terrifying realization struck him. He slowly turned his head back toward me, his bloodshot eyes widening with a sudden, desperate flash of comprehension. He pushed past a security guard and stumbled toward me, stopping just short of Isaiah's protective, immovable stance. He pointed a trembling, desperate finger directly at my chest, his face completely devoid of its usual arrogant pride. "The foreclosure," Thomas gasped, his voice, a ragged, breathless wheeze, echoing in the sudden quiet. "Vanguard holds that mortgage. You control Vanguard." With his entire world reduced to ash, the proud patriarch slowly dropped to his knees on the marble floor, looking up at me with tears of absolute desperation streaming down his face. "You can stop the eviction." Thomas stared up at me from his knees, his chest heaving as the crushing reality of his situation washed over him. The initial paralyzing shock that had brought him crashing to the floor began to morph rapidly into a twisted, desperate sense of entitlement. He pushed himself off the cold marble, rising to his full height, his expensive leather shoes squeaking slightly against the spilled champagne. He straightened his ruined posture, attempting to reclaim the absolute patriarchal authority that had been stripped from him mere moments ago. The fear in his eyes was instantly replaced by a burning, furious indignation. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, his voice losing its ragged wheeze and replacing it with his familiar, booming arrogance. "I am your father," Thomas demanded, the veins bulging prominently in his thick neck. "I put a roof over your head. I paid for your clothes. I gave you my last name. You owe me my house. You will pick up your phone right now, call the Vanguard Board of Directors, and cancel that foreclosure proceeding. You will wipe the slate clean." I did not reach for my phone. I did not flinch at his booming, aggressive voice. The absolute silence in the country club ballroom amplified the sheer absurdity of his demand. The wealthy onlookers, the corporate lawyers, and even the waiters stood entirely frozen, waiting for my compliance. They had all witnessed Thomas Lawson bully his way through life for decades, assuming I would simply fold under his immense pressure. Instead, I calmly unclasped the brushed gold hardware of my designer leather bag. I reached inside and withdrew a single crisp piece of heavy bonded paper. It was not a corporate printout or a digital copy. It was a legally binding, fully notarized deed of trust, stamped with the official raised seal of the Cook County Clerk. I held the document up, grasping it by the very edge so the harsh crystal lighting illuminated the embossed ink. "Vanguard Financial does not own the house anymore, Dad," I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy air with surgical, terrifying precision. Corporate foreclosure proceedings are messy, public, and highly bureaucratic. I did not want to leave anything to chance, and I certainly did not want a federal bank auction determining the fate of the property. I bought the debt personally this morning. I bypassed the entire corporate liquidation process and paid off the remaining principal in cash through my private holding company. Thomas blinked, his arrogant posture faltering as his brain struggled to process the absolute legal implications of my words. Brenda, who was still slumped against the cocktail table clutching her ruined designer dress, let out a low, pathetic moan. Sydney stopped rubbing her slapped cheek, staring at me, as if I had just spoken a foreign language. The meaning of the document was absolute and undeniable. I stepped closer to my father, invading his personal space, forcing him to look directly at the notarized seal bearing my legal name. "I am not an executive representing a faceless banking institution," I whispered, ensuring every single syllable landed with devastating, unyielding impact. "I am the sole legal owner of the property. I am your landlord." The word landlord hit Thomas like a physical blow to the chest. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the glass table behind him. He had spent his entire adult life building a grand, impenetrable illusion of aristocratic wealth, pretending to be a master of the universe who bowed to no one. Now the daughter he had treated like absolute garbage for 30 years owned the very roof over his head. I did not give him a single second to recover from the psychological shock. I reached back into my bag and pulled out a second sheet of paper. This one was entirely different from the heavy official deed. It was a standard, coldly clinical legal form. I stepped forward and slammed it down onto the glass surface of the cocktail table, right next to Isaiah's discarded wedding ring and the fraudulent bank statements. I slid the paper directly across the glass until it bumped against my father's trembling hands. "This is a formal 30-day eviction notice," I announced, projecting my voice so the entire room could hear the exact parameters of their impending ruin. "You have exactly 1 month to pack up your entire fake life. You have 1 month to box up your precious golf clubs, to pack away Mom's massive collection of fake designer handbags, and to completely vacate the premises. You will leave the keys on the kitchen counter, and you will get off my property." The country club guests began to murmur a low, buzzing hum of pure, unfiltered gossip. They were already mentally drafting the text messages and phone calls they would make the moment they left the ballroom. The Lawson family, the loudest, most arrogant members of the Oak Brook elite, were being formally evicted in the middle of their own hijacked celebration. Brenda buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the social execution was finalized. Sydney backed away from the table, trying to physically distance herself from the radioactive fallout of her parents' total bankruptcy. Thomas looked down at the eviction notice, his eyes tracing the bold black letters demanding his immediate departure from his own castle. The humiliation was absolute. He had been fired, publicly exposed for fraud, and physically assaulted by his own wife. Now he was being thrown onto the street by the scapegoat he had created. But the core of a true narcissist never actually accepts defeat. It simply pivots to a new extreme delusion. Instead of breaking down, instead of accepting the sheer, undeniable reality of his complete destruction, Thomas let out a sharp, ugly sneer. His upper lip curled into a mask of pure, unadulterated defiance. He ripped the eviction notice off the glass table, crumpling it into a tight ball in his fist, before throwing it aggressively onto the floor. He straightened his ruined suit jacket, his chest heaving with a sudden toxic surge of adrenaline. "Fine," Thomas spat, his voice laced with toxic, desperate arrogance. "I do not need you. I do not need your pity, and I certainly do not need your charity. You think you have me backed into a corner. You think you have stripped me of everything. You are completely forgetting who you are dealing with. I am not some broke, helpless victim. I have my offshore account in the Caymans. I have liquid capital that your little federal investigation cannot even touch. You want to play real estate games with me? Fine. I will just buy the house back from you in cash tomorrow." Thomas laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed unnaturally against the vaulted ceilings of the quiet ballroom. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined champagne-stained suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. His fingers flew across the screen, navigating to a secure, heavily encrypted banking application. He held the device like a weapon, his chest puffed out with the arrogant certainty of a man who believed he was utterly invincible. He actually looked around the room, making eye contact with the wealthy country club members, desperately trying to rally his peers to his side. He wanted them to see that he was still a master of the universe, that he could not be taken down by a simple real estate maneuver. "You really thought I would leave my entire financial future in the hands of a single corporation?" Thomas sneered, his eyes darting back to me, burning with toxic pride. "You think I am some amateur who puts all his eggs in one easily traceable basket. I am a regional director, Sienna. I know exactly how the financial system works. I know every single loophole, every blind spot, and every regulatory weakness that exists in the banking sector. For the past 10 years, I have been quietly skimming a fraction of a percent from our highest yield corporate accounts. It was nothing noticeable to the naked eye, just rounding errors and administrative fees that no one ever questioned. Just enough to build a bulletproof, impenetrable safety net in the Cayman Islands. He tapped the screen of his phone forcefully, bringing up his supposed account dashboard, his face twisted into an ugly, triumphant grimace. $2 million, Sienna. Untraceable, untaxable, and completely beyond the reach of David Mitchell, your little eviction notice, or your pathetic attempt at revenge. I am going to buy that house back from you tomorrow morning in pure cash, and then I am going to make sure my lawyers tie you up in litigation for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life. He thrust the phone forward, fully expecting me to cower at the sight of his hidden wealth. He expected me to shatter to realize that my grand master plan had failed because I had underestimated his criminal genius. I did not even blink. I maintained my absolute terrifying silence. I simply stepped aside, allowing Isaiah to move to the forefront. Isaiah smoothed his navy silk tie, his expression radiating the calm, clinical detachment of a professional executioner. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His quiet authority commanded the entire room. About that offshore account, Thomas Isaiah said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, cutting through my father's manic boasting like a scalpel. Thomas froze, his triumphant smile slipping slightly as he looked at his former son-in-law. The arrogant posture began to waver, replaced by a tiny creeping seed of doubt. Isaiah continued, his words precise, measured, and absolutely devastating. When I was gathering Sydney's fraudulent tax returns and fabricated corporate filings to hand over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I had to run a comprehensive forensic sweep of the shared domestic network. I was looking for Sydney's hidden digital assets to ensure the feds had a complete picture of her cosmetic company scam. But while mapping the data packets, I noticed some highly anomalous routing numbers bouncing through encrypted servers. Those numbers were deliberately obscured, but they were directly tied to your personal IP address, Thomas. Thomas swallowed hard, an audible gulp in the silent room. His grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles turned stark white. He tried to interrupt to brush it off, but his voice failed him. Isaiah took a slow, deliberate step closer, backing Thomas against the cocktail table. As a sworn financial compliance officer, Isaiah explained, his tone conversational but completely lethal. I am legally bound by stringent federal regulations. I am obligated by law to report any discovery of international wire fraud, money laundering, or undisclosed offshore banking tied to a domestic entity under federal investigation. Failure to report those anomalies would make me an accessory. It would result in the immediate loss of my own professional license and potentially my own freedom. The blood began to drain from Thomas's face, pooling in his neck as his breathing grew ragged and shallow. So Isaiah continued, never breaking eye contact, when I handed Sydney's massive tax fraud packet over to the federal authorities this morning. I included a very detailed, heavily documented addendum regarding your Cayman Islands routing numbers. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service work incredibly fast when they are handed a perfectly wrapped, irrefutable bow of corporate embezzlement and offshore tax evasion. I highly suggest you actually look at the screen of your phone, Thomas. Thomas snapped his gaze downward. He stared at the glowing screen of his banking application. The remaining color violently rushed out of his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty chalk. His mouth dropped open, but absolutely no sound came out. The bold digital numbers that had read $2 million just seconds ago had completely vanished. In their place, a stark, glaring red message blinked steadily against the white background. Account frozen. Federal seizure order. Balance $0. The phone slipped from his numb, trembling fingers. It fell through the air and clattered harshly onto the marble floor, the screen cracking upon impact. The final desperate illusion of the great Thomas Lawson shattered into a million irreversible pieces. He had absolutely nothing, No job, no house, no secret stash of stolen cash, and no escape from federal prison. He slumped forward, bracing his hands on his knees utterly and completely destroyed. The realization that the absolute last pile of money was gone hit Sydney like a speeding freight train. She had been kneeling on the floor, holding on to the desperate, clinging hope that her father's secret millions would somehow save her from ruin. She thought that Cayman money would hire the lawyers to keep her out of jail and fund her escape from this nightmare. Seeing her father turn into a pale, broken, penniless shell of a man snapped the final remaining thread of her sanity. The carefully curated, elegant influencer persona completely melted away, leaving nothing but a feral, greedy monster underneath. The absolute terror of losing her status, her wealth, and her freedom completely hijacked her brain. With a guttural, ear-piercing scream that sounded entirely inhuman, Sydney scrambled up from the champagne-soaked floor. She did not run to comfort her devastated mother. She did not try to support her broken father. She lunged directly at me. Her manicured hands clawed frantically through the air as she charged across the short distance between us. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with an unhinged, rabid desperation. She aimed straight for my designer bag, and the phone clutched in my hand operating on pure, mindless, animalistic greed. She somehow believed that physically attacking me would magically reverse the federal seizures and the foreclosure. "Transfer the money to me!" Sydney shrieked, spit flying from her lips as she violently thrashed against the space between us. "Give it to me, you ugly loser." Sydney launched her body across the marble floor with the rabid, uncoordinated ferocity of a starving animal. Her perfectly manicured hands morphed into desperate claws aiming directly for my face and the designer bag slung over my shoulder. She was operating entirely on blind, feral panic, completely convinced that if she could just physically rip my phone from my grasp, she could somehow reverse the catastrophic federal seizures and the devastating foreclosure that had just erased her entire existence. The scent of her heavy, overpriced perfume mixed sickeningly with the sharp tang of her nervous sweat as she closed the distance between us. Isaiah did not even flinch. He moved with the lethal practiced speed of a man who spent his life anticipating worst-case scenarios. Before Sydney's grasping hands could come within 3 feet of me, Isaiah stepped squarely into her path. He planted his tailored shoes onto the polished floor and turned his broad shoulders into an impenetrable solid wall of muscle and bespoke wool. He did not simply block her erratic charge, he actively intercepted it. His large hands caught Sydney squarely on her collarbones, and with a swift, calculated, and incredibly forceful shove he repelled her entire momentum backward. Sydney's designer stilettos lost all traction on the slick marble. She flailed wildly, her arms windmilling in the air as she was launched backward. She crashed directly into a towering, multi-tiered display of cheap, sparkling wine, the very same bottles the country club had quietly substituted for real champagne to accommodate my father's secretly dwindling budget. The impact was absolutely explosive. The entire table buckled under her weight, collapsing inward and sending hundreds of delicate crystal flutes raining down upon her. The deafening crash of shattering glass echoed through the vaulted ballroom, completely drowning out Thomas's frantic yelling. Sydney hit the floor hard, tangled in the ruined linen tablecloth, utterly buried beneath an avalanche of broken crystal and sticky, foul-smelling wine. The cheap alcohol instantly soaked through the expensive silk of her boutique dress, plastering her hair to the sides of her face in a dark, sticky mess. The Oakbrook Country Club security team had maintained a polite distance during the verbal shouting match, but outright physical assault immediately crossed their threshold of tolerance. 3 burly uniformed guards descended upon the wreckage of the champagne tower before Sydney even had the chance to sit up. They did not treat her like a VIP guest. They did not care about her millions of fake social media followers or her carefully curated influencer status. They treated her exactly like the violent, unhinged threat she was. The guards grabbed her arms roughly, forcing her face down into the puddle of spilled alcohol and shattered glass. Heavy industrial zip ties clicked loudly into place around her wrists, binding her hands securely behind her back. Sydney thrashed against the marble, kicking her ruined heels into the air and screaming completely incoherent obscenities, demanding that someone record this injustice for her audience. Brenda witnessed the brutal, humiliating subjugation of her golden child and the absolute total bankruptcy of her husband. Her mind, utterly incapable of processing the complete annihilation of her social standing, instantly defaulted to the only defense mechanism she had left. She needed to hijack the narrative. She needed to become the victim. Brenda inhaled sharply, clutching her chest with both hands, and let out a piercing theatrical wail that sounded like a dying siren. She conveniently staggered backward, her eyes darting quickly around the room to ensure she aimed herself perfectly toward a plush crimson velvet sofa near the coat check. With a dramatic, exaggerated gasp, Brenda collapsed onto the velvet cushions, draping her forearm elegantly over her forehead as she faked a spectacular silent movie-era swoon. Thomas saw his opening. He immediately pivoted from aggressive tyrant to panicked victim. He pointed a shaking finger at me and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded that someone call 911, shouting that my cruelty had just given his fragile wife a massive heart attack. He yelled at the surrounding wealthy elites, desperately trying to weaponize their empathy, hoping to completely derail the humiliation of the eviction and the federal fraud exposure. But the Oak Brook Country Club always kept a dedicated team of emergency medical technicians on standby during their high-profile corporate events. Two seasoned paramedics, completely unfazed by the hysterical screaming of a ruined executive, swiftly cut through the crowd carrying their heavy medical bags. They ignored Thomas's frantic, distracting demands and moved directly to the velvet sofa. One paramedic dropped to his knee. He did not ask Thomas for permission. He immediately grabbed Brenda's wrist, pressing 2 fingers against her pulse point. With his other hand, he pulled a small, incredibly bright penlight from his uniform pocket and shined it directly into Brenda's supposedly unconscious, fluttering eyes. The paramedic listened to her breathing, checked her skin temperature, and then slowly stood back up. His face was an absolute mask of professional, exhausted boredom. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the devastating medical diagnosis. "Her vitals are perfectly normal," the paramedic announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the dead silence of the room. "Her heart rate is completely steady, her pupils are responsive, and her breathing is entirely voluntary. She is faking it." The utter crushing embarrassment of that clinical deadpan announcement was lethal. Brenda's eyes snapped open. She realized instantly that no one was rushing to her side with cold compresses or words of comfort. The wealthy aristocratic guests she had spent 30 years desperately trying to impress were simply staring down at her with unfiltered, overwhelming disgust. She had faked a life-threatening medical emergency to escape accountability, and she had been exposed by a bored paramedic in less than 30 seconds. Meanwhile, the security guards hauled a screaming, thrashing Sydney to her feet. Her designer gown was shredded and stained her face a terrifying smear of ruined makeup and cheap wine. She spat vicious, hateful curses in my direction as the guards physically dragged her across the ballroom floor, hauling her forcefully toward the main exit to await the local police. Just as the guards pushed the heavy brass-studded oak doors open to physically remove my sister from the premises, the doors swung inward with immense, undeniable force. The guards immediately stopped, stepping aside to make way for the figure entering the room. An older, highly distinguished gentleman walked through the threshold, demanding immediate and absolute silence simply by existing. He was impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal gray suit that radiated a quiet, unimaginable tier of wealth. He possessed a sharp, silver-haired presence that made every single country club member in the room look like an amateur. It was William Sterling. He was not a local politician or a minor celebrity. He was Vanguard Financial's biggest private investor, a titan of industry whose personal liquid portfolio easily dwarfed the entire net worth of every single person in the Oak Brook Country Club combined. William Sterling adjusted his cuffs entirely, ignoring the screaming, wine-soaked woman being detained by security. He bypassed the whispering elites, stepped over the crumpled eviction notice, and locked his piercing, intelligent eyes directly onto mine. He held my gaze for a fraction of a second, a silent, chilling acknowledgement of the raw power dynamic actively shifting in the room. Then William Sterling turned his furious, unyielding attention to the pathetic, broken man kneeling amidst the spilled champagne and ruined cake. William did not raise his voice to a scream. He did not need to resort to hysterics like my mother. When a man whose personal net worth surpassed the gross domestic product of small island nations spoke, the world simply stopped spinning and held its breath to listen. The country club ballroom, already paralyzed by the previous chaos, became so completely silent that the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the lobby echoed like a bomb counting down. I just got a notification that my entire portfolio is currently under federal investigation. William stated his words, clipping through the heavy air with surgical, terrifying precision. What did you do with my money, Thomas? The question was not a request for clarification. It was a corporate execution order. Thomas let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. The sheer, overwhelming terror of facing William Sterling, his biggest client and the sole financial pillar holding up his entire regional branch, completely obliterated the last remaining shreds of his manufactured pride. The man who had spent his entire life demanding absolute respect and submission from everyone around him physically folded in on himself. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, ignoring the sharp shards of broken crystal biting into his palms, crawling directly toward the immaculate polished leather shoes of the billionaire investor. Sweat poured down Thomas's face in thick, greasy rivulets, staining the collar of his torn dress shirt and mixing with the scratches Sydney had left on his face. William, please, you have to listen to me. Thomas begged, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical whine that was genuinely nauseating to witness. It is just a minor compliance misunderstanding, a bureaucratic glitch. I just need 1 week to fix it. Give me 7 days, William. The great patriarch was groveling like a desperate animal. He grasped at the air, not daring to actually touch William's expensive trousers, but hovering his trembling hands in a gesture of pure, unfiltered supplication. I will personally guarantee a 20% return on your portfolio by the end of the quarter. Thomas babbled, his panic driving him to make wildly illegal, completely unrealistic promises in front of a room full of corporate lawyers and country club elites. I will move the assets into a high-yield, untaxed offshore shelter. You will double your initial investment by Christmas. Just call off the federal agents. Please, William, do not pull your accounts. I can fix this. The desperation was absolute and entirely pathetic. Thomas was openly proposing blatant illegal financial fraud, proving exactly how deep his corruption ran and how little he actually understood about the devastating trap I had sprung. The country club elite, the very people Thomas had spent decades trying to impress with his fake prestige and imported caviar, watched in horrified fascination. They were whispering behind their hands, actively witnessing the spectacular, humiliating demise of a man who had always looked down his nose at them. The mighty Thomas Lawson, the man who boasted about 6-figure bonuses and mortgage-burning parties, was now nothing more than a desperate criminal begging for his professional life on a dirty floor. William Sterling did not kick him away. He simply looked down at my father with the cold, detached disgust of a surgeon observing a fascinatingly grotesque parasite. The absolute silence of the room magnified the total, irreparable destruction of Thomas's dignity. He had sacrificed his daughter, his integrity, and his soul for the illusion of wealth, and now he was crawling on the floor begging for a single week of mercy from a man who despised him. I felt a profound, chilling wave of satisfaction wash over me. For 30 years I had been the scapegoat, the quiet disappointment hidden in the shadows while Thomas and Brenda paraded their golden child. Now the roles were permanently, irrevocably reversed. I was the one holding all the cards, and Thomas was the one begging for scraps. I watched my father debase himself for exactly 5 agonizing seconds before I decided it was time to end his professional existence permanently. I stepped smoothly around the cocktail table, putting my body directly between the groveling regional director and the billionaire investor. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable control. Mr. Sterling, I am the CEO of Aegis Equity, I announced, ensuring my voice resonated with total corporate authority, filling the silent ballroom with undeniable command. We have already secured your principal investment. William shifted his gaze from the weeping man on the floor to me, his sharp eyes narrowing with intense calculating interest. I did not blink. I stood tall, radiating the exact kind of ruthless clinical competence that my father had always pretended to possess, but entirely lacked. Thomas was running a highly unsanctioned, entirely illegal embezzlement scheme to fund his wife and daughter's fraudulent lifestyles. I continued speaking clearly, so every single country club member could witness the final lethal autopsy of the Lawson empire. My compliance team, working directly alongside federal agents, initiated a localized asset freeze this morning. We intercepted the fraudulent transfers and forcefully quarantined your capital before Thomas or his offshore contacts could finalize their theft. My firm has insured your assets fully. Your money is perfectly safe, Mr. Sterling. It is entirely isolated from the Vanguard federal raid. Thomas stopped crying. He remained frozen on his hands and knees, his mouth hanging open in sheer, unadulterated horror. He finally understood the full catastrophic scope of my strategy. I had not just exposed his crimes and bought his debt. I had anticipated his client's panic, swooped in as the ultimate corporate savior, and legally hijacked his most valuable asset right out from under his nose. I had stolen his king, and I had done it legally, flawlessly, and publicly. William Sterling processed my words with the rapid, brilliant calculation of a self-made titan. He looked at the forensic evidence sitting on the table, glanced at Isaiah, who gave a firm, professional nod of confirmation regarding the federal freeze, and then looked down at Thomas. The disgust on William's face hardened into absolute, unyielding stone. Thomas Lawson was no longer a financial director. He was a radioactive liability. William stepped deliberately over my father's outstretched, trembling hands. He closed the distance between us and extended his right arm. He did not offer a polite social greeting. He offered the firm, decisive handshake of a massive multi-million-dollar corporate transfer. "Ms. Lawson, you have my full trust," William announced, his voice booming across the ballroom, sealing Thomas's fate with absolute crushing finality. "Withdraw every cent from this Vanguard branch and move it directly to your headquarters." I took his hand, gripping it firmly, securing my absolute victory. Thomas's branch was officially dead. William Sterling did not spare another glance at the wreckage of the Lawson family. He released my hand, adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit jacket, and walked out of the Oak Brook Country Club ballroom with the exact same quiet, devastating power he had brought into it. The heavy brass-studded oak doors swung shut behind him with a resonant, booming thud. That single echoing sound acted as the final nail in the coffin of Thomas Lawson's entire professional existence. The branch was definitively, irrevocably dead. The corporate headquarters would undoubtedly terminate his employment by morning, assuming the federal authorities did not arrive at his doorstep to arrest him tonight. The surrounding country club, elites, the very people Thomas had spent his entire life currying favor with, immediately began turning their backs. They physically distanced themselves from the fallout, whispering frantically as they moved toward the exits, eager to abandon a sinking ship before the resulting whirlpool dragged them down as well. Thomas remained utterly frozen on the marble floor. His tailored suit was completely ruined, stained with cheap sparkling wine and wrinkled beyond repair. The man who had stood at the head of our dining room table for 30 years, barking orders and demanding absolute perfection, was entirely gone. In his place was a pathetic, whimpering shell of a human being. He looked at the empty space where William Sterling had just been standing, and then he slowly tilted his head to look up at me. His eyes were completely hollow, stripped of their usual arrogance, and replaced by raw, primal panic. He had lost his career, he had lost his house, he had lost his secret offshore account, he had lost his biggest investor. He had absolutely nothing left to his name except a massive impending federal indictment. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the muffled, hysterical sobs of Brenda still faking her illness on the velvet sofa and the distant sirens outside coming for Sydney. Thomas slowly shifted his weight on the polished marble. He did not stand up to face me like a man. He stayed on his hands and knees. With agonizing, humiliating slowness, The arrogant patriarch crawled over the shattered glass and spilled wine directly toward my feet. He reached out with trembling, blood-stained hands and actually grabbed the hem of my designer dress. His fingers clutched the fabric with a desperate white-knuckled grip. "Please. Sienna." Thomas wept, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed across the empty dance floor. He abandoned every single ounce of his pride, burying his face against the fabric of my skirt, entirely uncaring that the remaining catering staff and security guards were watching him debase himself. "You have to help me," Thomas babbled, fresh tears carving tracks through the grime and sweat on his face. "I am 60 years old. I have spent my entire life building that branch. I have nothing left. No one in the entire financial sector will ever hire me with an active federal investigation hanging over my head. My reputation is completely destroyed. You hold all the cards now. You are the CEO of Aegis Equity. You have unlimited power. Give me a job." He looked up, his face a mask of absolute desperation, begging for salvation from the daughter he had spent a lifetime calling worthless. "Anything, Sienna," he pleaded, his voice cracking with the strain of his own humiliation. "I will take anything you have to offer. I will be an analyst. I will be a senior consultant. I can run a regional desk for your firm. I still know the markets. I still have connections. Just give me a desk and a salary so I can afford legal representation. Do not leave me out in the cold, please." I looked down at the man clutching my dress. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of daughterly affection. I simply felt the cold, hard weight of absolute justice. I looked at his desperate, pleading eyes, and my mind instantly snapped back exactly 5 years ago. I remembered sitting on the floor of my childhood bedroom, completely consumed by severe clinical depression, begging for a fraction of emotional or financial support. I remembered the cold, disgusted sneer on his face when he stood in my doorway and told me I was a pathetic burden. I reached down and forcefully peeled his trembling fingers off my dress, stepping back to break his physical connection to me. I smoothed the fabric and looked him dead in the eye. "You told me I was a failure, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic sobbing with lethal precision. "When I came to you 5 years ago, drowning in depression and begging for help, you stood over me and laughed. You told me I was completely useless. You told me I wasn't fit to sweep your floors. You said the business world was entirely reserved for winners like Sydney and that I should just disappear." Thomas flinched as if I had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse to blame Brenda, to beg for forgiveness, but I held up my hand to silence him. However, I continued, letting a small, clinical smile touch the corners of my mouth. "I am not the monster you raised me to be. I actually believe in second chances." A sudden, desperate flash of hope ignited in Thomas's red-rimmed eyes. He gasped, nodding frantically, believing that his pathetic groveling had actually worked. He truly thought the family bond had overridden my logic. He thought I was going to hand him a lifeline, a 6-figure consulting contract that would save him from absolute ruin. I reached into my bag one final time. I bypassed the Vanguard financial audits, the federal fraud documents, and the property deeds. I extracted a single heavily folded piece of paper. I did not slide it across the cocktail table. I held it out, forcing him to reach up from his knees to take it from my hand. Thomas snatched the paper with greedy, trembling fingers. He scrambled to unfold it, his eyes darting hungrily across the black text, searching for a job title, a salary, an executive sign-on bonus. Instead, his face went completely blank. The desperate hope in his eyes instantly died, replaced by a fresh, suffocating wave of utter humiliation. It was not an executive contract. It was not a consulting agreement. It was a standard entry-level employment application for the Aegis Equity corporate mailroom. "This is an application for the basement sorting facility," I announced, ensuring my voice carried the absolute, unyielding authority of a chief executive officer addressing a subordinate. "Minimum wage. No benefits. No corporate parking space. No expense account. You will spend your days pushing a metal cart and delivering envelopes to the executives who actually earned their positions. You report directly to the 22-year-old shift manager on Monday morning. Do not be late. Thomas stared at the single sheet of white paper as if it were coated in a lethal flesh-eating poison. His eyes darted frantically back and forth across the bold, unyielding print of the entry-level application, his brain violently rejecting the reality of the words. Mailroom, minimum wage, shift manager. The paper trembled violently in his blood-stained, wine-soaked hands. The final, absolute realization that his entire legacy had been completely dismantled and reduced to a minimum wage sorting facility crushed the last remaining breath out of his lungs. He slumped forward onto the marble floor, defeated, broken, and entirely silent. Watching her father physically and professionally disintegrate snapped whatever fragile restraint Sydney had left. She was still pinned to the floor by the 3 heavy security guards, her arms securely fastened behind her back with industrial zip ties. The sharp shards of broken crystal dug into her knees, and the sticky, foul-smelling residue of the cheap, sparkling wine coated her skin and ruined her designer gown. She realized with absolute terrifying clarity that there was no secret fortune. There was no grand legal rescue. There was no daddy coming to save her. Operating purely on the desperate, panicked survival instincts of a cornered predator, Sydney violently wrenched her shoulders to the side. The sudden, erratic movement caught the nearest security guard slightly off balance, allowing her to twist her upper body around. She ignored me completely. She ignored her weeping father. She locked her wide, terrified, tear-filled eyes directly onto the tall, impeccably dressed figure standing just a few feet away. Sydney instantly abandoned her feral rage and defaulted to the only manipulative tactic she had left. She weaponized her vulnerability. Her face crumpled into a mask of exaggerated, helpless agony. Massive, heavy tears spilled over her eyelashes, cutting clean tracks through the smeared mascara and wine staining her cheeks. She let out a pathetic, high-pitched sob, projecting the image of a terrified, defenseless wife. "Isaiah, please!" Sydney wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation as she strained against the plastic ties binding her wrists. "You have to stop this. You have to help me. We are married, Isaiah. You are supposed to protect me." The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the handsome, successful compliance officer would actually fall for the desperate, sobbing performance of his ruined wife. Isaiah did not rush to her side. He did not drop to his knees to brush the wet, sticky hair out of her face. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He stood perfectly still, towering over her with the cold, unbiding posture of a judge presiding over a guilty verdict. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands and adjusted his pristine, monogrammed cuffs. He looked down at the weeping, wine-soaked woman on the floor with a calm, surgical detachment that was utterly terrifying in its absolute lack of emotion. "I protected you from yourself for 4 years, Sydney," Isaiah said. His voice was not raised, but the deep, resonant baritone cut cleanly through her theatrical sobbing, carrying an aura of absolute, chilling finality. Sydney choked on a fake sob, looking up at him with wide, confused eyes. "I paid off your secret credit cards when you hid the statements." Isaiah continued, his words striking her like physical blows. "I covered up your endless financial mistakes to my own family, so they would not see what a greedy, shallow liability you truly were. I worked 80-hour weeks to fund a lifestyle that was never enough for you while you filmed unboxing videos of stolen merchandise to impress strangers on the internet. I stood between you and absolute ruin a dozen times, Sydney. But you did not want a husband. You never wanted a partner. You wanted an ATM." The clinical, devastating accuracy of his words completely shattered Sydney's victim performance. Her mouth dropped open, and the fake, manipulative tears instantly dried up, replaced by a stark, horrific realization that her husband had seen entirely through her facade for years. Isaiah reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He did not pull out a handkerchief to dry her eyes. He pulled out a heavy ring of keys. He held them suspended in the air for a fraction of a second, forcing Sydney to look at them before he simply opened his hand. The keys fell through the air and hit the hard marble floor directly next to her zip-tied hands with a sharp metallic clatter. "I already moved all of my personal belongings out of the downtown condo this morning while you were getting your hair done," Isaiah stated, his tone perfectly flat and devoid of any lingering affection. The lease is up next week, and my name is no longer on the renewal agreement. Good luck explaining your lavish, fraudulent lifestyle to the federal agents when they arrive to seize your remaining assets. Sydney stared down at the keys resting in the puddle of spilled wine. The absolute crushing terror of her reality finally descended upon her. She had no money, no home, no husband, and no escape from the impending federal indictment. She was completely and utterly isolated. Isaiah did not spare his wife another glance. He turned his broad shoulders away from the wreckage of his marriage and looked directly at me. The cold, surgical detachment melted away, replaced by a look of profound mutual respect. We were two incredibly competent professionals who had successfully engineered the total extraction of the toxic parasites feeding on our lives. He gave me a single crisp nod of his head. "Ms. Lawson," Isaiah said, his voice ringing with genuine professional admiration, "a pleasure doing business with you." Without another word, Isaiah turned and walked purposefully toward the grand brass-studded oak doors. He pushed them open and stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the stifling, corrupted atmosphere of the country club completely behind him. He did not look back. Isaiah, Sydney screamed, her voice tearing from her throat in a guttural, desperate shriek that sounded entirely inhuman. "Come back! You cannot leave me here!" "Isaiah!" She thrashed violently against the security guard, screaming his name until her vocal cords shredded, but the heavy oak doors had already swung shut. He was gone. The realization that Isaiah's lucrative, bulletproof compliance salary had just walked out the door finally pierced through Brenda's shock. She was still sitting on the crimson velvet sofa, having completely abandoned her fake fainting spell. Brenda looked at the shattered remains of her husband groveling on the floor, and then she looked at the screaming, thrashing mess of her favorite daughter. The survival instincts of a woman who had spent her entire life stepping on others to maintain her status kicked into overdrive. She realized instantly that Sydney was no longer a golden ticket. Sydney was a federal liability. Brenda lunged forward from the velvet cushions. She did not rush to comfort her terrified, screaming child, her face twisted into an ugly, vicious mask of pure hatred. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at the daughter she had spoiled and coddled for 30 years. "You lost the only good thing you had, you stupid girl!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing with venomous, unparalleled betrayal. "You ruined everything." Brenda did not stop at simply shouting. The absolute loss of her pristine, carefully guarded social status drove her into a state of sheer, unadulterated madness. She lunged forward, her manicured hands curling into fists, and began physically striking her golden child. She hit Sydney on the shoulder, slapped at her tear-stained face, and violently yanked at the torn fabric of her expensive boutique dress. "You ruined my life!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, ugly shriek that reverberated off the vaulted ceilings. "You greedy, stupid girl! You lost the money. You lost Isaiah. My friends are watching this. My country club membership is gone. We have absolutely nothing left because you could not keep your husband under control." Sydney, still bound by the heavy industrial zip ties, could not raise her hands to defend herself. She thrashed on the floor, using her bare legs to kick wildly at her mother's shins. She twisted her face away from Brenda's frantic slaps, her own voice tearing from her throat in a feral, defiant roar. "You made me this way!" Sydney shrieked right back, spittle flying from her lips as she fought against the security guards holding her down. "You taught me how to do this. You told me to marry for money. You told me to use him like a bank account. You raised me to be exactly like you, and now you are mad that I got caught. You are a fake, pathetic old woman, and I hate you." The two women who had spent decades presenting a united, flawless front of aristocratic superiority were now tearing each other apart like rabid dogs in the middle of a spilled puddle of cheap wine. They clawed, kicked, and screamed, airing every toxic, venomous secret they had ever kept from the world. A few feet away, Thomas remained completely paralyzed on the cold marble floor. He was utterly oblivious to his wife and daughter destroying each other. His bloodshot, terrified eyes were glued to the single sheet of white paper clutched in his trembling hands. The mailroom application. He stared at the bold, unforgiving text detailing minimum wage requirements and mandatory shift hours. The reality of his absolute irreversible downfall finally fractured his mind. The great regional director, the man who had ruled his family and his office with an iron fist, curled his body inward and began to sob. He wept with loud, gasping, heavy heaves, his tears dripping down his chin and soaking the entry-level employment form. I stood a few feet away, perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of my abusers. For years, I had fantasized about this exact moment. I had laid awake in my small, cramped apartment, meticulously planning the exact words I would use to finally make them understand the depth of the pain they had inflicted upon me. I had curated speeches, practiced arguments, and imagined screaming my truth until my lungs gave out. But standing there watching the Lawson family empire completely cannibalize itself, I realized with absolute profound clarity that I did not need to say another word. There was no grand speech required. There was no final insult needed to seal their fate. They were their own punishment. The toxic, fragile, entirely superficial ecosystem they had spent 30 years building had finally collapsed in on itself. They were drowning in the exact same poison they had forced me to swallow my entire life. I was no longer a participant in their dysfunction. I was simply a spectator observing the inevitable metaphorical burning of their fraudulent kingdom. I turned my back on the pathetic scene playing out on the floor. I scanned the perimeter of the ballroom, my eyes easily cutting through the whispering, horrified crowd of country club elites. I found exactly who I was looking for. David Mitchell, the acting branch manager who had blindly followed my father's corrupt orders for years, was cowering behind the carving station at the buffet table. He was clutching a linen napkin, sweating profusely, trying desperately to blend into the floral arrangements and avoid eye contact with anyone holding authority. "David," I called out. My voice was perfectly calm, leveled, and stripped of all emotion, but it carried across the room with the lethal trajectory of a sniper bullet. David jumped as if he had been physically struck. He dropped the linen napkin and stumbled forward, nearly knocking over a silver chafing dish. He scrambled around the edge of the buffet table and practically jogged across the dance floor, coming to a halt 3 feet away from me. He stood at rigid attention, his face pale and his hands shaking at his sides. "Liquidate this entire branch by Friday afternoon. I ordered delivering the final definitive business directive of the night. You will personally oversee the immediate dismantling of Thomas's entire regional infrastructure. I want severance packages drafted and fully funded for every single innocent employee who was unknowingly dragged into this mess." David swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. However, I continued stepping closer to ensure he felt the full weight of my authority. "There will be 0 severance, 0 benefits, and 0 golden parachutes for any member of senior management. Anyone who touched Thomas's offshore accounts or facilitated Sydney's fraudulent shell companies gets nothing but an empty cardboard box to pack their desk." "Understood," David squeaked, his voice cracking. "Take every single remaining liquid asset tied to this specific branch's discretionary fund," I instructed, delivering the final poetic strike. "You will draft a certified wire transfer and donate the entire remaining balance directly to the Chicago Women's STEM Initiative. Fund the exact women Thomas spent his entire career actively trying to suppress. Have the confirmation receipts on my desk by Monday morning." David nodded frantically, his head bobbing up and down in absolute terrified submission. "Yes, boss," he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Right away, boss. I will get it done exactly as you asked." I did not offer him a smile or a handshake. I simply turned away, adjusting the strap of my designer bag on my shoulder. My work here was entirely finished. The ledger was completely balanced. I began walking toward the grand oak doors leading out to the main lobby. My heels clicked against the marble floor in a steady, rhythmic cadence. "Sienna, wait." The desperate, gravelly scream echoed behind me. Thomas was trying to crawl across the floor, reaching out with his empty, shaking hands, begging for the daughter he had thrown away to turn around and save him from the hell he had built. I did not stop. I did not pause. I did not even break my stride. I walked out of the ballroom, leaving the heavy oak doors to swing shut behind me completely and permanently, sealing the Lawson family inside the wreckage of their own making. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut with a solid, satisfying weight, instantly severing the connection to the ballroom. The frantic, echoing sounds of my family's screaming, the shattering glass, and Thomas's pathetic wailing were abruptly muffled, reduced to nothing more than a faint, pathetic hum behind the thick wood. The grand foyer of the Oak Brook Country Club was entirely silent, bathed in the soft, warm glow of crystal chandeliers. I walked across the plush carpets, my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders completely relaxed. For the first time in my entire existence, I was not carrying the suffocating heavy expectations of the Lawson name. I had shed it completely, leaving it in a ruined, wine-soaked puddle on the ballroom floor. I pushed through the glass front doors and stepped out into the freezing Chicago winter night. The biting, icy wind whipped across the stone portico, carrying the sharp sting of impending snow. By all accounts, I should have been shivering in my silk designer gown. Instead, a radiant, undeniable warmth spread outward from the very center of my chest. I felt incredibly light, as if the physical laws of gravity had suddenly shifted, unburdening my bones. The frigid air hitting my face tasted like absolute, unadulterated freedom. I walked down the sweeping stone steps with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who owned her entire world. At the base of the driveway, my private driver, Marcus, stood at perfect attention beside my sleek black Maybach. The pristine vehicle idled quietly, its sleek lines reflecting the ambient light of the street lamps. Marcus moved smoothly to open the rear passenger door for me, offering a respectful nod. Before I stepped into the heated cabin, a flash of movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. A few yards away, walking purposefully toward a waiting black luxury rideshare, was Isaiah. He had his collar turned up against the wind, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his tailored overcoat. He paused, feeling my gaze, and turned to look back at me across the frosted pavement. We did not need to exchange a single spoken word. The distance between us crackled with the shared unspoken understanding of two prisoners who had meticulously dug their way out of the exact same cell. We had both been dragged into the Lawson family asylum. We had both been used, manipulated, and bled dry to fund their superficial delusions of grandeur. And tonight we had both executed the perfect, flawless extraction. Isaiah offered a slow, deeply knowing smile. It was the smile of a fellow survivor. I returned the expression, inclining my head in a silent salute to his tactical brilliance. He nodded back, stepped into his waiting car, and vanished into the Chicago night. I slid into the cavernous, leather-appointed back seat of the Maybach. Marcus gently closed the heavy door, sealing me inside a vault of absolute silence. The ambient interior lighting cast a warm, comforting glow over the cabin. As the luxury vehicle pulled away from the country club curb, gliding smoothly onto the main road, I turned my head to look out the tinted window. I watched the sprawling, elite facade of the Oak Brook Country Club gradually shrink and disappear into the darkness. For years, society and media had taught me that revenge was supposed to be loud. It was supposed to be characterized by screaming matches, thrown punches, shattered plates, and dramatic tear-filled monologues. I had believed that vindication required dragging your abusers down into the mud and fighting them on their own toxic territory. But sitting in the serene quiet of my car, I realized the absolute fallacy of that concept. True lethal revenge was completely silent. It was not about sinking to their level or screaming until your throat bled. True revenge was simply outgrowing the people who had spent their entire lives trying to keep you small. It was expanding your mind, your resources, and your empire until you became a massive, undeniable force of nature. It was recognizing that their insults, their manipulations, and their desperate grasping for control were nothing more than pebbles bouncing off the walls of a titanium fortress. My family had tried to bury me in the dark, entirely unaware that I was a seed. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dim cabin, instantly displaying a cascade of executive notifications. I bypassed the panicked, frantic emails rolling in from the remaining Aegis Equity board members who had just heard the news about the Vanguard acquisition. A financial alert popped up on my home screen. Aegis equity stock was up another 6% in aftermarket trading. The aggressive, ruthless liquidation of the corrupted regional branch had already sent a massive wave of absolute confidence through the financial sector. The market recognized a lethal, uncompromising chief executive officer, and they were rewarding my decisive action with millions in increased valuation. My net worth had literally increased while I was walking down the front steps of the country club. I looked at the rising green numbers, feeling a profound sense of validation. But instead of diving into the emails, instead of drafting orders for the morning, or calling my legal team to finalize the liquidation protocols, I did something I had not done in 5 years. I pressed the power button. The screen instantly went black. I dropped the phone back into my designer bag, leaned my head against the plush leather headrest, and simply closed my eyes. I did not need to work tonight. I did not need to plan, scheme, or fight. I just wanted to sit in the darkness and enjoy the profound, beautiful, unprecedented quiet of a life that finally belonged entirely to me. Sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to buy the board. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace and build your own empire? Share your story in the comments below. Remember, the people who call you a failure are usually just terrified of what you will achieve once you stop seeking their approval. Like and subscribe for more stories of sweet absolute justice.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly, I am